All right, good morning. We're going to go ahead and pick up where we left off in chapter 1 of Night. So, yesterday we read the first 4 pages and then we read just this top little part on page 5. And today we're going to read about 4 more pages in chapter 1 and then we will be finishing chapter 1 tomorrow. All right, so just to remind you, when we left off, the Germans had just arrived in Sayet, Eliezer's hometown. And so far, all of the Jews have sort of heard rumors about how the Germans were violent, threatening, but their first impressions of them did seem like the Germans were very polite and non-threatening. So we're going to see how that is obviously going to change as the Germans start to implement certain rules for the Jews. All right, so again, we are going to start off right here at the top of page 5, starting where it says the week of Passover, and then we're going to read to about halfway down page 9. You are welcome to read on your own, or you can follow along right now as I read it to you. All right, here we go. The week of Passover. The weather was wonderful. My mother bustled round her kitchen. There were no longer any synagogues open. We gathered in private houses. The Germans were not to be provoked. Practically every rabbi's flat became a house of prayer. We drank, we ate, we sang. The Bible bade us rejoice during the 7 days of the feast, to be happy, but our hearts were not in it. Our hearts had been beating more rapidly for some days. We wished the feast were over so that we should not have to play this comedy any longer. On the 7th day of Passover, the curtain rose. The Germans arrested the leaders of the Jewish community. From that moment, everything happened very quickly. The race toward death had begun. The first step, Jews would not be allowed to leave their houses for 3 days, on pain of death. Moshe the beadle came running to our house. I warned you, he cried to my father, and without waiting for a reply, he fled. That same day, the Hungarian police burst into all the Jewish houses in the street. A Jew no longer had the right to keep in his house gold, jewels, or any objects of value. Everything had to be handed over to the authorities on pain of death. My father went down into the cellar and buried our savings. At home, my mother continued to busy herself with her usual tasks. At times, she would pause and gaze at us, silent. When the 3 days were up, there was a new decree. Every Jew must wear the yellow star. Some of the prominent members of the community came to see my father, who had highly placed connections in the Hungarian police, to ask him what he thought of the situation. My father did not consider it so grim, but perhaps he did not want to dishearten the others or rub salt in their wounds. The yellow star? Oh well, what of it? You don't die of it. Poor father, of what then did you die? But already they were issuing new decrees. We were no longer allowed to go into restaurants or cafes, to travel on the railway, to attend the synagogue, to go out into the street after 6 o'clock. Then came the ghetto. 2 ghettos were set up in Sayet. A large one in the center of the town occupied 4 streets, and another smaller one extended over several small side streets in the outlying district. The street where we lived, Serpent Street, was inside the first ghetto. We still lived, therefore, in our own house. But as it was at the corner, the windows facing the outside street had to be blocked up. We gave up some of our rooms to relatives who had been driven out of their flats. Little by little, life returned to normal. The barbed wire which fenced us in did not cause us any real fear. We even thought ourselves rather well off. We were entirely self-contained, a little Jewish republic. We appointed a Jewish council, a Jewish police, an office for social assistance, a labor committee, a hygiene department, a whole government machinery. Everyone marveled at it. We should no longer have before our eyes those hostile faces, those hate-laden stares. Our fear and anguish were at an end. We were living among Jews, among brothers. Of course, there were still some unpleasant moments. Every day, the Germans came to fetch men to stoke coal on the military trains. There were not many volunteers for this kind of work. But apart from that, the atmosphere was peaceful and reassuring. The general opinion was that we were going to remain in the ghetto until the end of the war, until the arrival of the Red Army. Then everything would be as before. It was neither German nor Jew who ruled the ghetto. It was illusion. On the Saturday before Pentecost, in the spring sunshine, people strolled, carefree and unheeding, through the swarming streets. They chatted happily. The children played games on the pavements. With some of my schoolmates, I sat in the Ezra Malik Gardens, studying a treatise on the Talmud. Night fell. There were 20 people gathered in our backyard. My father was telling them anecdotes, expounding his own views on the situation. He was a good storyteller. Suddenly, the gate opened, and Stern, a former tradesman who had become a policeman, came in and took my father aside. Despite the gathering dusk, I saw my father turn pale. "What's the matter?" we all asked him. "I don't know. I've been summoned to an extraordinary meeting of the council. Something must have happened." The good story he had been in the middle of telling us was to remain unfinished. "I'm going there," he went on. "I shall be back as soon as I can. I'll tell you all about it. Wait for me." We were prepared to wait for some hours. The backyard became like the hall outside an operating room. We were only waiting for the door to open to see the opening of the firmament itself. Other neighbors, having heard, had come to join us. People looked at their watches. The time passed very slowly. What could such a long meeting mean? "I've got a premonition of evil," said my mother. "This afternoon I noticed some new faces in the ghetto. 2 German officers, from the Gestapo, I believe. Since we've been here, not a single officer has ever shown himself." It was nearly midnight. No one wanted to go to bed. A few people had paid a flying visit to their homes to see that everything was all right. Others had returned home, but they left instructions that they were to be told as soon as my father came back. At last, the door opened and he appeared. He was pale. He was surrounded. How avid we were at that moment for one word of confidence, one sentence to say that there were no grounds for fear, that the meeting could not have been more commonplace, more routine, that it had only been question of social welfare, of sanitary arrangements. But one glance at my father's haggard face was enough. "I have terrible news," he said at last. Deportation. The ghetto was to be completely wiped out. We were to leave street by street, starting the following day. We wanted to know everything, all the details. The news had stunned everyone, yet we wanted to drain the bitter draught to the dregs. Where are we being taken? This was a secret from all except one, the president of the Jewish Council. But he would not say. He could not say. The Gestapo had threatened to shoot him if he talked. "There are rumors going around," said my father in a broken voice, "that we're going somewhere in Hungary to work in the brick factories. Apparently, the reason is that the front is too close to here." And after a moment's silence, he added, "Each person will be allowed to take only his own personal belongings, a bag on our backs, some food, a few clothes, nothing else." Again, a heavy silence. "Go and wake the neighbors up," said my father, "so that they can get ready." The shadows beside me awoke as from a long sleep. They fled silently in all directions. For a moment, we were alone. Then suddenly, Batia Reich, a relative who was living with us, came into the room. "There's someone knocking on the blocked-up window, the one that faces outside." It was not until after the war that I learned who it was that had knocked. It was an inspector in the Hungarian police, a friend of my father. Before we went into the ghetto, he had said to us, "Don't worry. If you're in any danger, I'll warn you." If he could have spoken to us that evening, we could perhaps have fled. But by the time we had managed to open the window, it was too late. There was no one outside. The ghetto awoke. One by one, lights came on in the windows. I went into the house of one of my father's friends. I woke up the head of the household, an old man with a gray beard and the eyes of a dreamer. He was stooped from long nights of study. "Get up, sir, get up. You've got to get ready for the journey. You're going to be expelled from here tomorrow with your whole family and all the rest of the Jews. Where to? Don't ask me, sir. Don't ask me any questions. Only God could answer you. For heaven's sake, get up." He had not understood a word of what I was saying. He probably thought I had gone out of my mind. "What tale is this? Get ready for the journey? What journey? Why? What's going on? Have you gone mad?" Still half asleep, he stared at me with terror-stricken eyes, as though he expected me to burst out laughing and say in the end, "Get back to bed. Go to sleep. Pleasant dreams." Nothing's happened at all. It was just a joke. My throat was dry, the words choked in it, paralyzing my lips. I could not say any more. Then he understood. He got out of bed and with automatic movements began to get dressed. Then he went up to the bed where his wife slept and touched her brow with infinite tenderness. She opened her eyes, and it seemed to me that her lips were brushed by a smile. Then he went to his children's beds and woke them swiftly, dragging them from their dreams. I fled. Time passed very quickly. It was already 4 o'clock in the morning. My father ran to right and left, exhausted, comforting friends, running to the Jewish council to see if the edict had not been revoked in the meantime. To the very last moment, a germ of hope stayed alive in our hearts. The women were cooking eggs, roasting meat, baking cakes, and making knapsacks. The children wandered all over the place, hanging their heads, not knowing what to do with themselves, where to go, to keep from getting in the way of the grown-ups. Our backyard had become a real marketplace. Household treasures, valuable carpets, silver candelabra, prayer books, Bibles, and other religious articles littered the dusty ground beneath a wonderfully blue sky. Pathetic objects which looked as though they had never belonged to anyone. By 8 o'clock in the morning, a weariness like molten lead began to settle in the veins, the limbs, the brain. I was in the midst of my prayers when suddenly there were shouts in the street. I tore myself from my phylacteries and ran to the window. Hungarian police had entered the ghetto and were shouting in the neighboring street, "All Jews outside, hurry." Some Jewish police went into the houses, saying in broken voices, "The time's come now. You've got to leave all this." The Hungarian police struck out with truncheons and rifle butts to right and left without reason, indiscriminately, their blows falling upon old men and women, children and invalids alike. One by one, the houses emptied and the street filled with people and bundles. By 10 o'clock, all the condemned were outside. The police took a roll call, once, twice, 20 times. The heat was intense. Sweat streamed from faces and bodies. Children cried for water. Water? There was plenty, close at hand, in the houses, in the yards, but they were forbidden to break the ranks. Water, mummy, water. The Jewish police from the ghetto were able to go and fill a few jugs secretly. Since my sister and I were destined for the last convoy and we were still allowed to move about, we helped them as well as we could. Then, at last, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, came the signal to leave. There was joy. Yes, joy. Perhaps they thought that God could have devised no torment in hell worse than that of sitting there among the bundles in the middle of the road beneath a blazing sun, that anything would be preferable to that. They began their journey without a backward glance at the abandoned streets, the dead, empty houses, the gardens, the tombstones. On everyone's back was a pack. In everyone's eyes was suffering drowned in tears. Slowly, heavily, the procession made its way to the gate of the ghetto. And there was I on the pavement, unable to make a move. Here came the rabbi, his back bent, his face shaved, his pack on his back. His mere presence among the deportees added a touch of unreality to the scene. It was like a page torn from some storybook, from some historical novel about the captivity of Babylon or the Spanish Inquisition. One by one, they passed in front of me. Teachers, friends, others, all those I had been afraid of, all those I once could have laughed at, all those I had lived with over the years. They went by, fallen, dragging their packs, dragging their lives, deserting their homes, the years of their childhood, cringing like beaten dogs. They passed without a glance in my direction. They must have envied me. The procession disappeared round the corner of the street. A few paces farther on, they would have passed beyond the ghetto walls. The street was like a marketplace that had suddenly been abandoned. Everything could be found there. Suitcases, portfolios, briefcases, knives, plates, banknotes, papers, faded portraits, all those things that people had thought of taking with them and which in the end they had left behind. They had lost all value. Everywhere rooms lay open, doors and windows gaped onto the emptiness. Everything was free for anyone, belonging to nobody. It was simply a matter of helping oneself. An open tomb, a hot summer sun. All right, we are going to pause there until tomorrow. Again, you are welcome to read ahead to the end of the chapter if you want to, but I will be posting the part 3 video and questions tomorrow on Thursday. All right, so get in touch with me if you have any questions about today's reading, and I will talk to you all tomorrow. Bye.